This position in 1866, first ever world champion Wilhelm Steinitz creates an immortal king hunt. Let's see what happens here. So in the game, Steinitz is up in development. He's already castled and has all of his pieces on good squares, while white still has his king in the center of the board. So Steinitz starts the combination off with pawn to e3, advancing the pawn forward trying to open up the e-file and go after white's king. So white decides to deal with this by castling. But now Steinitz keeps up the pressure and he plays queen to h5. This move brings the queen further into the attack and attacks his bishop on h4. So the bishop goes back to g3. And now Steinitz continues with pawn to e2, advancing the pawn forward to attack the rook, and once the rook moves back, it's no longer guarding the f2 square. So Steinitz continues with rook takes f2, sacrificing the rook in order to overload the bishop on g3. If the bishop takes the rook, then we have queen to h2 check, and that would be checkmate because the pawn on e2 covers the escape. So instead of taking the rook, the opponent just plays knight to d2, trying to develop their last piece and desperately try to orchestrate some sort of defense. But Steinitz does the same and plays the calm rook a to f8, bringing his final piece into the attack. And here white comes up with a nice defensive idea. They play pawn to c4, advancing the pawn forward in order to activate the queen's access to the king side because it was stranded on the other side of the board. But this defense is simply too slow. Steinitz continues with rook takes g2, sacrificing the rook because after the king takes, we follow up with queen to h3 check, sacrificing the queen on an empty square in order to get the king under the mask of the bishop. And if you don't take this queen and go back to h1, then the idea was rook to f2, again overloading this bishop on g3, because if you take, then queen takes h2 is checkmate. So the opponent just takes the queen and hopes that he could survive, but he can't. Steinitz gets to show off his idea. He plays knight to e3 check. This opens up the check from the bishop, and this knight on e3 does not let the king go back to its castle on g2, so the king has to walk up the board. So the king walks up, and now we play knight to g2 check, bringing the king even further down the board. And here Steinitz finishes it off. He plays rook to f5. After the king steps over, pawn to h5 check. Only move king to h3. And now Steinitz finishes it off with rook to f2. Checkmate.